Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Lisi. Thanks to everyone at the Center for organizing these and for all the wonderful other talks that the Center organizes. It's a great pleasure to be here to very briefly introduce a person who's someone we all know and many of us have been friends with for a long time, Ben Kerkvliet. If you were going to draw a Venn diagram of great scholars and good people, the center of that Venn diagram would be called Ben Kerkvliet. For decades now, he has shown a commitment to students, to scholarship, to social change, to understanding social change through his work in the Philippines, his work in Vietnam, and more broadly around Southeast Asia and Asia. His recent work has been about protest and the state in Vietnam, as many of you know, culminating in a book that was published on this topic in 2019. But he's been active in Vietnam and studying Vietnam and understanding Vietnam for a long time, since the early 1990s. A transition from working on the Philippines that, as many of you know, those transitions are not the easiest to make. Many of us have tried to make those transitions, but very few as successfully as Ben. So we're here to listen to Ben talk today about Vietnam's responsive-repressive regime based on the book and other observations he may have. Ben's going to talk with us for a little while to our very large audience, at least 60 people. And then we're going to do questions through the chat room. So if you can type your questions in the chat room, I will then read them to Ben and he will answer them or try to answer them. And with that, and with tremendous gratitude to Ben for joining us from Hawaii, please listen to Ben Kerkvliet on Vietnam's responsive-repressive regime. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that generous introduction. And I'd like to thank everyone that's on the video here or on the program here for listening in and being interested in this topic. I also want to thank Mary McCoy and Lisi Doty and the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. It's terrific for me to be at the University of Wisconsin again, even though only virtually, having been a graduate student there from roughly 1965 to 1972 with big gaps doing research in the Philippines. I have numerous fond memories and much gratitude to the university and to numerous people there at that time. I want to mention a few names that may have been lost in history, but some of them you will know. Language teachers Patricia Hamilton and Tunggul Siagian were the mainstays of Indonesian language program during those years. Elena Reyes taught me Tagalog while I was there. Historian John Smale, who I think of very often, especially in recent days. Political scientist Fred Vondermayden, followed by Jim Scott, followed by Don Emerson. And toward the end of my stay came geographer Dan Deppers, who I think is still in the Madison community. These people and many others helped me with my studies, helped me get scholarships so I could continue my studies and do research. I'm forever grateful for all of that. So let me now turn to the topic of Vietnam and its regime. Foreign commentators often depict the Vietnamese Communist Party government as extremely repressive, allowing little or no criticism of the government or of government policies. For instance, Freedom House reports during the 2009-2015 period often said things such as Vietnam's regime silences critics through numerous methods, and every year since 2007, the intolerance for political dissent has been growing, and a climate for civil liberties and political freedoms has been worsening. Annual reports about Vietnam from Human Rights Watch, US State Department human rights reports often depict during that period of the 2000s till recent years, until now really, the regime as being intolerant of political dissent of any kind. For instance, a human rights report of 2013, its Vietnam chapter opened with the passage that read, quote, "The Vietnam government systematically suppresses freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly, and persecutes those who question government policies, expose government corruption, or call for democratic alternatives to one-party rule. Police harass and intimidate activists and their family members." My assessment of the Vietnamese government's regime is somewhat different. Certainly, political repression exists in Vietnam and is often very brutal. But the frequent depictions like those that I've just referred to are incomplete. Research by myself and others show that political criticism in public has increased in intensity and widened in scope since the mid and late 1990s. And that furthermore, the government's reactions have often included the repression, but also toleration and responsiveness. And that responsiveness has included, in several important ways, policy changes to accommodate those critics. Now, before I elaborate on this, I want to give some background for those who may not be too familiar with what's happened politically, economically over the last several decades in Vietnam since the country was reunified in 1975-76 after the wars there. In numerous respects, the political situation has not changed much. The Communist Party of Vietnam still rules. It's the only legal political party. It's very much entwined from top to bottom, bottom to top with the government. So it's often hard to distinguish between what's the Communist Party of Vietnam and what's the government of Vietnam, whether you're at a village talking with officials or looking at national meetings of top authorities. Elections occur in Vietnam every 5 years for local and authorities and for the National Assembly, which is the government's primary legislative body. But those elections allow only the Communist Party to have candidates, and occasionally there are independent candidates, some of whom occasionally also win. But despite these continuities, political and economic life in Vietnam has changed significantly since the early 1990s. On economic dimensions, for instance, World Bank data shows that while in the 1980s, Vietnam was one of the poorest countries in the world, but by the early 2000s, Vietnam was ranked among the middle income countries in World Bank data. Poverty in the early 1990s in Vietnam was, according to World Bank, 60-some% of the Vietnamese population. By 2010, that number had dropped to 21%. And in 2019, World Bank data indicates poverty in Vietnam is now around 6%. Housing, education, food availability, health, and other living conditions in Vietnam have greatly improved over the decades for most Vietnamese. Institutional and structural economic changes since the mid-1980s, some of them as a result of bottom-up pressure, have resulted in the market economy replacing state-run economy that was prevalent up until the mid and late 1980s. Family farming has replaced collectivized agriculture. Private businesses and industries in Vietnam have mushroomed. And the state's reach into people's lives has become much shorter over the last few decades. Vietnamese citizens have much greater freedom to choose where they live, how they work, where they work, whether they travel and where they travel to. People can form their own groups around shared interests, whether that be sports or religion, gardening, health issues, politics, and other topics. And people in Vietnam have pretty ready access to news and other information sources well beyond the state-controlled media. For instance, in the early 1990s, very few Vietnamese citizens had a television, and even fewer had a telephone. But by 2012, most Vietnamese had both, and over 35% had access to the internet. In 2020, late 2020, about 67% of Vietnamese citizens had internet access. The big change that has interested me in my research has been the rise and diversification of public political criticism. Prior to the early 1990s, people who were critical of various aspects of the government, of their living conditions, or what have you, expressed their complaints among friends and close confidants, rarely doing much in the way of public display or indication of their problem. But since the late 90s through the 2000s, criticism and activism on a variety of issues has become much more open and visible, to the point of, as this photo suggests, people standing out in the street saying they don't really like the Communist Party of Vietnam. Public demonstrations, marches, petitions, letter writing campaigns are common in Vietnam. People write essays, make videos, prepare newsletters and post them on the internet. Blogs are there as well, with people contributing and writing their concerns. These materials are filled with commentaries, suggestions, and satire. Starting around 2003, I began, with the help of a research assistant, to collect as much of these materials as possible and supplement them with interviews and observations in Vietnam. My focus has been in the period 1995 to 2015, and looking at 4 types of citizens who have been openly critical on matters important to them and pressing for political and policy changes. One group are factory workers. A second are lowland villagers. A third are people who are upset with China and the Vietnam-China relations. And the fourth group are advocates of democratization. And one of the main questions that I've tried to address what are the reactions of government and Communist Party authorities? And that's what I'd like to focus on today. Let's look first at factory workers. Their political criticisms over the last several decades have been on their wages and their treatment and their conditions of labor. They talk about low wages. They protest against wages that are below minimum wage that is set by the state. They protest against abusive managers and factory workers who slap them, swear at them, cheat them of their wages, don't pay them overtime that's due to them, and so on. And their actions have included petitions, letters to factory owners and managers, to government officials. They go and seek out journalists and say, come and look at how we're living and working, and please do stories on us. And journalists do, in large numbers of articles published in both the official and the unofficial media sources in Vietnam about working conditions. Workers also engage in numerous strikes of various kinds: sit-down strikes, sit-in strikes, walkouts, picketing, walking through streets with signs. In 1995 to 2015, there were nearly 6,000 strikes in Vietnam. And in the last few years, 2016 to 2020, there have been an additional 1,000. None of these strikes were legal. None met the requirements set down by law as to when a strike could be legitimate in the eyes of the law. They did not, for instance, the strikes, for instance, were not preceded by mediation efforts, or the strikes did not involve get the support or the leadership of the authorized local trade union. Authorities' reactions, however, have been very tolerant of these strikes, despite their illegality. Strikers are not criminalized, very, very rarely arrested. Police very infrequently interfere with the strikes. Rarely do police and strikers have any kind of physical or even verbal conflict. Meanwhile, authorities have often been rather responsive to the strikers. Coming out in public, officials will say, well, the workers have justification for what they're doing because their complaints have merit. They are being paid wages that are below standard. They are being cheated of their overtime payment. Factory workers and managers are to blame, authorities will frequently say, for the strikes. And authorities frequently try to get involved when the strikes have occurred, of trying to bring settlement and negotiating with the factory owners and managers into meeting with the factory strikers and to come to some kind of agreements. The reactions of authorities have also been responsive to the point of making policy changes in line with the workers' demands. These policy changes are examples of institutionalized responsiveness, which is the subject of a new dissertation by Dr. Nu Chuong, In the Shadow of Authoritarian Expropriation, that she finished last year at McGill University. Examples of the institutionalized responsiveness policy changes regarding workers in Vietnam include one starting in 2005, 2006, numerous strikes by workers were emphasizing the extremely low minimum wage that the state had set. So the strikers were pushing for a higher minimum wage. And not just in that period, but even before. But the result was in 2006, a response on the part of the government to set higher minimum wages, and then pretty much annually thereafter to up those wages. In 2012, the strikes contributed to the government establishing a national wage council that set wage standards. And in 2015, waves of strikes protesting a new law regarding retirement benefits pressured the Prime Minister and the country's parliament, the National Assembly, to replace that law with one that complied with workers' demands. There's also been repression against workers who are publicly criticizing policies and working conditions, but primarily that's been at the expense of workers who are trying to form their own unions, independent of the state-sponsored unions in Vietnam. And that repression has included intimidation, but also some of those leaders attempting these new organizations have been imprisoned. In recent years, however, Vietnam authorities have gravitated toward allowing independent unions, a result of international pressure, but also internal pressure from workers themselves. So let me turn now to the second group, villagers. From the late 1990s, authorities in Vietnam have sought to convert agricultural land to make space for urban housing, schools, roads, factories, and industrial zones. Laws have allowed authorities to cancel villagers' use rights to agricultural land in order to convert such land to these other purposes. Laws have been vague about the processes for such land conversions and about how much compensation the farmers whose fields are being confiscated are entitled to. And by 2010, approximately 9 million farming families, equaling about 10% of Vietnam's population, had lost their farmlands. Most of those families were near towns and cities that were expanding to accommodate more urban environment and these factories and industrial zones. But the farming families, by and large, did not go quietly. In the 1990s through 2016, there have been widespread protests, demonstrations, petition campaigns by villagers demanding to keep their farms, demanding greater compensation, accusing officials of stealing essentially their land because the compensation has been so poor. Some demonstrations had over 1,000 people coming from different villages and different provinces, converging on government buildings, such as the ones shown in these photos in Ho Chi Minh City, but also in Hanoi and in other towns and cities. Some of these large demonstrations have lasted for weeks. Many other demonstrations and protests were smaller, but lasting for months and sometimes years. People assembling at district and provincial offices, holding their placards, shouting slogans, trying to present petitions, having meetings with local officials, seeking to prevent the confiscations from occurring or increasing the payments that would be received. Authorities' reactions have included considerable toleration and responsiveness. Police typically stand by, they monitor what's going on, and they prevent obstruction of traffic, but rarely interfering with the protesters or arresting them. Officials have organized efforts to find out in more detail what is bothering villagers. So they send out teams to investigate and talk with the villagers who are upset. And in the process, have often found in favor of what the villagers were complaining about, saying that, yes, the villagers have been unfairly treated by local authorities, the compensations are too small, etc. Frequently, the compensations have been increased as a result of the protests, and government has changed policies. The institutionalized responsiveness along the lines that New Chung's dissertation talks about. For instance, a new land law in 2013 accommodated some of the villagers' concerns. Some provisions greatly reduced the kinds of projects that could justify confiscating farmland. Other provisions required that such projects be approved by the National Assembly, in addition to some other national and provincial bodies. Some other provisions reduced the discretion that district officials have over land. And provisions also empowered villagers to negotiate directly with those seeking their land, a process that up until very recent years, up until that law, it had been very difficult for protesters to meet with the people who were trying to actually get the land. The outcome of this legal law change and other actions on the part of the government in recent years is that the number of land confiscations in Vietnam has dropped noticeably, and the number of protests also have dropped since 2016, 2017. Repression against protesting villagers has included intimidation and harassment. For instance, protesting villagers would find that the irrigation to their fields was cut off, or that their children were barred from attending the local school because of local authorities were taking hostile actions toward the families because of their protests against the confiscation process. There was also violence in the form of people being pushed off physically or with equipment, such as photoed here, because they had refused to leave, refused over the course of months and sometimes years. And then finally, the government took physical action. The most severe repression that I'm aware of occurred in January last year, when hundreds of police raided a village in Dom Tam, an area about 40 kilometers from central Hanoi, and in the process killing the leader of a long-standing protest against land confiscation in Dom Tam area, and arresting several of his relatives and other followers. The third group are the critics of China and of Vietnam-China relations. Between 2005 and 2015, hundreds of demonstrations occurred in Vietnam against China. Hundreds of petitions as well were organized, circulated, gathered signatures online. People were upset with Chinese vessels attacking Vietnamese fishing boats and Vietnamese vessels that were exploring for oil and gas and other resources in what China calls, or some parts of the world call, the South China Sea. Vietnamese tend to call it the East Sea. People were also protesting against the Chinese occupying Spratly Islands and Paracel Islands at the expense of Vietnam, because these islands are within territorial waters of Vietnam. and various other encroachments by China at the expense of Vietnamese territory have been among the complaints. Demonstrations and petitions have also been pressing Vietnamese authorities to protect Vietnamese fishermen, to file charges against China in international courts, to join with other countries, especially in the region, to counter Chinese aggression. The reactions on the part of authorities have mainly been toleration to the demonstrations and to very little police interference. Some people do get arrested, more get detained and then are released after a few days or a few weeks. Petitions against China and pressing the government to take China to court have not resulted in much, if any, repercussion to the petitioners. There has been some responsiveness on the part of the government to these protests about China. Sometimes authorities have endorsed the protest. Sometimes authorities have met with demonstrators and petition organizers. The authorities have sometimes been prompted by the protests to be more condemning of Chinese actions and maybe to take a little bit more vigorous steps to oppose Chinese actions in the East Sea. In mid-2019, public criticisms may have influenced Vietnam's government to use the Navy, the Vietnamese Navy, to confront Chinese ships in an area called the Vanguard Bank, which is within Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. Vietnamese vessels have been exploring off and on for natural resources in the seabed in 2017 and 2018 when they were trying to do that near the Vanguard Bank. Chinese ships showed up and the Vietnamese withdrew fairly quickly. But in 2019, the Vietnamese ships, with the support of the Navy, sort of stood their ground, as it were, against the Chinese and did not back down. And the two forces sort of eyed each other for several months before both receded. So that the protests about China may have encouraged Vietnamese authorities to be more vigorous in their stance in 2019. There's also been some repression against the demonstrators, using police to disrupt, scatter, detain, sometimes beat the protesters, and as I mentioned, sometimes get arrested. Usually the use of police to break up demonstrations occurred when the demonstrations were very, very large or had lasted for many, many weeks, or in cases where demonstrations took place despite very, very widely circulated and vigorous prohibitions by the state. The fourth group have to do with people pushing for free speech, human rights, multi-party elections, separation of powers, and other aspects of democracy. They do this through petitions, through open letters, blogs, online publications, such as the two I've depicted here, advocating all kinds of, making all kinds of arguments for democracy and numerous criticisms about the present political situation. Some of these people over time have formed civil society groups and other organizations to focus on particular aspects of their concerns about needing democratization, such as this group of independent journalists that have been publishing a newspaper online and doing other activities. Authorities' reactions have been far more repressive against the pro-democracy people as compared to their repression against workers and villagers and the protests regarding China. The pro-democracy people are often intimidated in various ways. Their phone lines cut, their emails accounts are blocked and hacked. The websites are interrupted, firewalls are established, etc. Sometimes people have their jobs disrupted or even taken away. There have been physical attacks against pro-democracy people being beaten up, pro-democracy people suddenly being rammed by a vehicle, causing them injuries. Their homes frequently have been ransacked, raided, their computers and other personal belongings taken, etc. There have also been numerous detention, arrests, trials, and imprisonment. But there's also some toleration of democratization activists. Although many have been arrested and imprisoned, there have been many that have not been imprisoned. I've followed over the last several years 68 very active pro-democracy people. And of those, 28%, 19 of them have not been, as of 2015, imprisoned. 72% were imprisoned. And of those that were imprisoned, after being imprisoned and serving, that is, they served their time, they got released, they resumed their political advocacy, but they were not rearrested. 20% of them were rearrested, and 10% seem to have stopped their public activity. The point here is that there's some degree of toleration on the part of authorities to people who are advocating democratization, in that not all of them have been arrested or rearrested. Arrests and imprisonment are somewhat episodic. There are many in some years, few in other years. Among the people that I've been following, the 68, the high point of arrests for them was in 2005, 2009. 52% of those arrested were so in that period, whereas in previous years and in 2010, 2015, the percentages of people arrested were much smaller. Other people's data about political prisoners in Vietnam also reflect this kind of episodic nature. Circa 2000, there were approximately 60 political prisoners in Vietnam, according to groups like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and others. 2015, about 175, and then a big drop in 2016. And now, more recently, there's been a big increase in the last few years. What accounts for this? Why some people are arrested and imprisoned, why some are imprisoned but not re-imprisoned, why some years the number of people arrested are higher and other years much smaller. The explanations for these are still, for me anyway, not terribly clear. But from what I can gather, part of it has to do with the characteristics of the critics, of the regime critics. People who are older, say 60 years of age or more, are less likely to be arrested, even if they are advocating democratization. People who have served, have a record of having served in the military, be government officials, especially high-level government officials, or prominent or fairly prominent Communist Party members or former Communist Party members, those people also seem less inclined to be arrested or rearrested. Also, people who are not as confrontational, I guess is the word, as others are less likely to be arrested. So by that I mean people who are trying to form opposition political parties are more apt to suffer severe repression compared to those who are actually avoiding trying to get involved in any opposition parties. There's also another factor maybe explaining the ups and downs of imprisonment, has to do with debates within the Vietnamese Communist leadership about how to deal with democratization advocates. I think in the period from 2010 to 2016, the top leadership seems to have backed away from incarceration. And according to some evidence, instead saw that a better way of trying to stifle democratization would be through intimidation and violence, even physical attack against individual advocates. Circa 2017 to 2020, the top leadership seems to have become more inclined to arrest and imprison these critics. There's been some modest responsiveness on the part of authorities to democratization advocates, occasionally meeting authorities at fairly prominent levels of government, and the party will meet with democracy advocates, talk about the petitions that the advocates have submitted and so forth. An example was in 2013, the National Assembly was charged with drafting a new constitution for Vietnam, and the committee that was primarily involved circulated a draft or several drafts. And in that process, numerous people outside of the government began discussing on the internet, face-to-face and in other ways, that draft or those drafts that the National Assembly was circulating, and began to make suggestions of how to improve it, to make it the Constitution more democratic, to create a more democratic political system, in effect, for Vietnam using this Constitution. And several groups came together and wrote their own proposed Constitution. And these petitions and that draft of a new Constitution by these critics was sent to the National Assembly and its committee. And there were meetings that occurred, such as depicted here, between some of the people on the National Assembly's committee and some of the prominent people who had drafted a proposed alternative and had been circulating it. So overall, to sum up, Vietnamese authorities have been most repressive to factory workers, most responsive to factory workers pushing for better working conditions, to villagers who have been trying to protect their land and if they must give it up to get better compensation. These responses by the state to workers and villagers has included significant policy changes to accommodate those criticisms. The most repressive aspects have been by the government and the party have been against democratization advocates, but authorities have even shown some toleration towards them. So thank you very much for listening. And if you have questions, Mark will send them my way, I think.
Absolutely. Ben, thank you very, very much. Terrific presentation. We appreciate it. I'm going to start with questions, focusing on the questions that relate to public protest in Vietnam. Before I do that, I want to mention, because Ben neglected to, probably out of modesty, that the book on which Ben's talk is based is called Speaking Out in Vietnam, Public Political Criticism in a Communist Party-Ruled Nation, published by Cornell University Press, and is available through any way in which you get books. So let me begin with questions. I'm going to go more or less in chronological order as they came in. As I said, focusing on the questions that relate to public political criticism. We have a question initially from Jim Cobb. In the early 2000s, my observation was that surplus provinces, Ho Chi Minh City, Haiphong, Da Nang, were less repressive, less strict than those provinces which were heavily dependent physically on transfers from Hanoi. And that observation is from the early 2000s. And he's asking, Ben, would you agree? If it was the case then, do you think it still is the case? Do you think there are these regional differences based on economic relationships with Hanoi as to public political criticism and repression? So Ben, that's the first question.
I'm not familiar. There are regional differences, but when Mr. Cobb, is it, that asked the question?
Yes.
I don't know what criticisms he's referring to. Are these have to do with the workers that were demonstrating and protesting? Does it have to do with the land issues or environment maybe? It could be there are regional differences with regard to issues like land, environment, factory working conditions, because in those cases, there is a fair amount of discretion, if I understand it anyway, of local authorities, provincial and district, as to how they're going to deal with, say, a demonstration about polluted waters running from a factory into nearby fields of villagers. In some places, authorities might be very eager to try to stop the pollution in other places and therefore sympathize with the protesters. In other areas, a district authority or provincial authority might be on the side of the polluters and more apt to intimidate or try to stop the protesters. So it partly maybe is a regional thing, partly is an issue thing. For democratization people, my understanding is that those are national decisions. People who are very strong advocates of democratization who get arrested and imprisoned, they're probably those people are being targeted by national authorities. Some of them, if they're very, very prominent, probably by some prominent person in the Prime Minister's office or in the Ministry of Security, even by the minister or Prime Minister, him or herself. Repression against advocates of democracy would be more of a national matter, but how local authorities deal with other issues tends to be not necessarily require national involvement.
Thank you, Ben. Next question, which although the author of the question doesn't refer to it directly, also echoes some discussions in the China studies field recently. The question is, the regime typology responsive-repressive regime reminds me of the similar authoritarian typology of the Malaysian party regime that Harold Crouch introduced to account for the UMNO's survival and party control over the state in the Malaysian context. Could you tell us more about the relations between the Communist Party and the state apparatus in Vietnam? Some Vietnam scholars emphasize the domination of the party over the state, while others suggest the other way round. And I'll just insert sort of in brackets here that that's the discussion that is, of course, also occurring in the China studies community right now. Does it tell us about the responsiveness by the party regime for its survival? Where does that responsiveness come from?
It's interesting that you mentioned Malaysia, because the terminology that I've been using, responsive repressive, the what do I call it? What got me thinking along these lines was the book by Harold Crouch, published by Cornell around the late 90s, as I recall. I think it's called Government of Malaysia. And Harold does talk about the responsive and repressive character of the prime minister and his government of the time, Mahathir. And it does resonate with what I was observing in the 2000s as I was doing this research for Vietnam. So governments that are responsive and repressive are not peculiar to Vietnam. All kinds of governments are both, including the United States and Australia and other what we call democracies. It's the degree and the kind and the institutions that require or encourage or allow responsiveness and repression that differs. The institutions are important. So the relations between the state or the government and the party in Vietnam, I think there are arguments that the government is more independent of the party in Vietnam than, so I'm told, than in China. But there's disagreement about that, and I don't have any, insight. I haven't done research specifically on this, so my familiarity with the degree to which the two are really separable is very limited. My understanding is that in Vietnam, the party and the state are very closely entwined. There have been occasions where it seems as though the state is more stepping aside, resisting some of the leadership claims and demands of the party. But overall, I think the two are very closely entwined.
Ben, thank you. And I should have mentioned that question came from, and I apologize for any mispronunciation, Kekue Hamayotso. Next question. And again, I'm focusing on the questions. Many questions have come in. I'm focusing on the questions chronologically that relate to public political criticism and suppression in Vietnam. Question from Billy Noseworthy from Madison. And it's a question, Ben, that relates to events after your book was published.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be interested in hearing Professor Kerkvliet's take on the, quote, suppression measures, unquote, taken by the Vietnamese government regarding COVID, and how this fits into the discourse internationally about freedoms versus relative success in Vietnam in dealing with the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
The relative centralization of the state in Vietnam, the ability to lock down entire provinces, conduct contact tracing, and use other measures that are often labeled as authoritarian in terms of the suppression of the pandemic. What does this bode for the future? How does this play out in terms of balancing values of public health versus democracy and participation? A broad question on which we could easily have an entire session by itself, which is in fact true with many of these questions. But that comes from Billy Noseworthy, and any thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Also, thank you, Kikaway, for the previous question. I have followed the reporting by journalists and scholarly literature that's been done by some close analysts of Vietnam about how Vietnamese government and individuals in society have dealt with COVID. My understanding, could be wrong, is that Vietnam as a whole, the government and the people have dealt with COVID very well. Relatively few cases per population, relatively few deaths per population. The disease has been stomped out in most parts of the country, and when it pops up, authorities, with a lot of compliance, as I understand it, by people in society, take precautions, quarantine themselves, do a lot of tracing, and all of that. So my sense is that the government as a whole has done a very good job of limiting COVID and its adverse consequences, deaths and hospitalization, with measures the government has taken, but with a lot of compliance, pretty much unopposed by citizens. And what helps to explain this, I think, is not that society generally, people generally are enraptured with and totally laudatory and supportive of the government and the Communist Party that leads it, but rather they have been convinced by the data that this disease is serious, that you need to take fairly rigorous actions in order to stop it. So they don't object, so far as I know, to these occasional lockdowns. They haven't conflated that with give me my freedom of speech or something like that. But rather they've gone along with it because they know from their own reading and what officials that they believe and trust have told them, that we have to wear masks, we have to quarantine, we have to do tracing. And it's not seen as a big imposition on people. Now, that's my understanding of the situation, but I haven't looked at it up close at a particular town or a particular village or anything like that. But from what I've read, that seems to be the situation.
Thank you, Ben. And now a question, and again, I'm going to ask as many of these questions as I can until Mary or Elise tells us that our time is up. Now a question that is more personal to you, and it's from, and I'm always mentioning the names, I'm not sure I would always do that, but since Ben knows everyone in the field, it's probably useful for Ben to hear who the questions are from. This is from Herman Koenigs. Dear Ben, I have huge respect for scholars who engage in sensitive topics in the context of authoritarian regimes. I wonder how your book affects your ability to continue to research in or travel to Vietnam. Have you faced reactions or pushback from the Vietnamese state? To which I would add, Ben, have you had reactions from Vietnamese intellectual colleagues or even protesters who may be familiar with the research in the book?
Thank you for the question. I haven't tested those waters yet, partly because of COVID. I haven't traveled to Vietnam. The plan was to go this year or 2020, but COVID, as you know, everybody knows, has put a lot of travel plans on hold. So I don't know whether I could return to Vietnam as a researcher to get a visa that would allow me to do research. I think I could, but I can't say for sure until I try. When doing the research for the book, I did, up until the latter stages of the research, I did not I didn't push the envelope too hard to test to how far I could go in seeking out pro-democracy people, for instance. I eventually did that, but after about 2012, 2013, I could tell from all previous trips that things were loosening up, that it would be more possible to contact those people, then that doing so would not get those people in trouble, and I would not get in trouble. But earlier on, I avoided doing that. The reactions on the part of the government to the book, I would argue they should be kind of happy with it. I talk about, it's not my intent, but I do talk about things that probably they think are okay, the responsiveness part. They may not like the stuff I talk about with regard to repression, but that's out there for everybody to see anyway. It's not just me that's been doing that. Mark, you had an additional part there. What was it that you asked?
Really about reactions from intellectuals to the book.
Yes.
But again, you haven't been able to go, so that.
No, but I have sent the book in an e-format to people, to a number of people. And some of them don't read English, but those that, and then I was hoping that maybe they could get a family member or somebody to read it for them and summarize it. Some do read English, and in both cases, I've heard back positive things. That is to say, they appreciate the book. They've told me that the overall point seems relevant, seems accurate in the sense that there is this dynamic in Vietnam, that these kinds of public criticisms have become more common over the years, and some of these people have been active in that. So in that sense, the reactions, so far as I can tell, have been supportive. I've sent the book to a few people who have family members in prison, and I've not heard back from them other than thank you very much, nice cover, that kind of thing. But I haven't heard. There are some people from whom I haven't heard. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. And now a question from our own Ian Baird at UW-Madison. Ian says, there appears to be much more tolerance in Vietnam than in Laos. I wonder why. And then he asks, or he says, but in Laos, veterans, military veterans, have been able to criticize more. Mm-hmm. What about veterans and criticism in Vietnam?
Yeah, I don't know about the veterans. I know there are individual people who are been involved with NGOs working not specifically on democratization, but on environmental issues, or with some of these workers I refer to who are veterans, that is, they served in the military. I can think of one or two who have been officers. There are some pro-democracy people who are veterans. And as I mentioned, sometimes having been a veteran in the military gives people a little bit more latitude to speak out on human rights and that kind of thing. But I don't know that, so I can only think of particular individuals. I wouldn't be able to say as a group that the veterans are one way or the other on these various issues. Why there's more latitude or more responsiveness in Vietnam than Laos? I think, I don't know the situation in Laos very well, but from what I understand of Vietnam's situation and the history of the party in Vietnam and the governments that it's formed, since 75, there is there's a sense on the part of many government and party officials that to rule, we have to be responsive. To have a government, we can't just say my way or the highway, do as we say, regardless of whether you like it or not. That's not the attitude that comes through in what authorities say in their sort of formal settings, but also in their informal settings. The conversations I've had, the meetings that I've observed, not necessarily a participant, but sitting in large groups when authorities are talking with citizens about various issues, whether it's education or health or housing or working conditions. Authorities are often listening, trying to think, okay, now what can we do to deal with this? Their attitude is more along those lines than shut up, or we don't want to hear you, or you don't know what you're talking about. That kind of attitude doesn't come through very often. It's more listening and trying to be accommodating. Now, of course, there are limits, and they're not all authorities in Vietnam are like that, but generally speaking, that's my sense. And we see it in various mottos, slogans that the government puts up and the party puts up, about the importance of listening to the people, the importance of the party being accountable to the people, that kind of thing. Those are very common.
Thank you. We also, Ben, had a question about the role of the Vietnamese mass organizations in the criticism of the party and state, and how the party and state reacts to that criticism. This isn't in the question, but obviously they've played the transmission belt going back to the Soviet days. And the real question, I think, is how has the role of the mass organizations changed as the criticism has grown? Are they on the responsive side, the repressive side? Where do mass organizations like the Women's Union or the Peasants' Union fit into all this?
Mm-hmm. The one that I'm most familiar with in terms of having read material, having documents, are the official trade unions in Vietnam. I'm not so familiar with the women's groups or the peasant organization in terms of what they've done, but the official trade unions have often been involved. They've been involved in transmission belt kind of activity. As I mentioned, when these strikes occur, even though they're not led by the local trade union or have involvement with the local trade union as the strikes are being put together and carried out, they often do end up the trade unions get involved in trying to resolve the problems. And the trade unions have also been involved in these efforts in recent years to consider the possibility of allowing independent trade unions to be formed. So they've been sitting at the table of discussions that involve government officials, workers, as well as representatives from the International Labor Organization, the ILO, the international actor on this ground. From what I understand about villagers is these land controversies that have gone on in Vietnam do not seem to involve much activity by the local units of the official peasant organization, in Vietnam. So I don't see them being active at all, one way or the other. On some environmental issues, I've seen accounts that the local units of the official peasant organization have been unsupportive, oftentimes, of villagers who are upset with polluted waters coming from factories or from urban areas flowing into their fields. But that's only a few instances that I can think of. But on the whole, I know that there are these various organizations within the Homeland Front or Fatherland Front. Individuals in those groups have been involved in some of these protests against China, not in their role as a member of some Fatherland Front group, but just individually. And then there have been a few protests against China in which the youth organization within the Fatherland Front have joined as members of the youth organization, although they tend not to mix in the marches and in the demonstrations out in the streets with the other demonstrators. They sort of keep to themselves and have their own slogans and placards, but they have been there.
Thank you. That question was from Merle. I don't have a last name on that. A question now from Borja Lundgren. Apologies for mispronunciation. Borja is the former Swedish ambassador to Vietnam and China and former director general of Swedish SIDA, the aid agency. Sweden's been involved with Vietnam for decades, as has Borja. And Borja asks a question on the labor rights and labor criticism issue. He says Vietnam has entered into a number of major free trade agreements, like with the EU, where improved labor rights is an issue. And he asks, how might international involvement in labor issues, for example, through these agreements, affect labor criticism and labor protests on the ground in Vietnam? And I'm adding, in fact, sort of amending Borja's question, or does the party state sort of consider them two different things, dealing with the outside world on labor and dealing with domestic protest groups on labor? Anyway, the question is, how does the international work on labor with Vietnam interact with the domestic criticisms?
Nice to hear from you, Borja. Been a long time. My understanding is that the international labor organizations, the ILO as a whole, and then various other parts of the world labor movement, unions in Australia, Europe, elsewhere, have been part of these ongoing discussions over the last 10 years or so regarding labor conditions generally and the possibility of labor organizations, independent labor organizations specifically. So the Europeans, the Australians, and the ILO seem to have been important contributors to the Vietnamese government now being open to and seem to be quite close to agreeing to allowing, under certain parameters, independent labor organizations. So that has been very important, these international efforts, combined with the efforts on the part of numerous workers in Vietnam who have been pushing also in the same direction for greater latitude to form their own groups rather than having to work with the official labor organizations. So my sense is this this combination of discussions and pressure from international side and the pressure from the Vietnamese workers has been having some impact on the government and the Communist Party in Vietnam. The person that has been doing research on this that I'm most familiar with is Anita Chan at the Australian National University. She's published in such journals as Contemporary Southeast, Journal of Contemporary Southeast Asia, I think is the name of it. And I can't think of the others right now, but she's been following this matter of international labor groups and their importance and actions in Vietnam, and they're combining with local workers' activities in Vietnam. So I hope that helps, Boria.
Thank you, Ben. We have time for a couple more questions. I apologize. I'm not going to get to all the questions, and I'm pleased to pass on the ones that I don't get to that relate to criticism directly to Ben. A question from UW-Madison's own Larry Ashman. Larry is primarily responsible for the wonderful collection that we have of Southeast Asian materials at UW-Madison, and we are grateful to Larry. Larry asks, as the older party leaders pass on, might the new younger ones be more responsive to pro-democracy ideas? But I'm also going to ask that the other way, Ben, from the China perspective. Is it possible that the new younger leaders are more rigid, less responsive to pro-democracy ideas than the ones who came before them?
I don't know whether there's a distinction about being more open by among the younger party members compared to older ones, or less open by the younger compared to older. I do know that there are debates within the party about these matters of how to deal with critics, particularly regarding critics of the whole regime, people pushing for democracy. And there are party members who, both young and older, who think it's important, even vital, for Vietnam to become more open politically, for the system to allow, for instance, other political parties to run in elections. There are party members, as I say, from what I read, both younger and older, who push for that. But there are also younger and older party members who totally oppose it. They see that it's having other political parties run in elections, for instance, will be the beginning of the end of party rule, and Vietnam will disintegrate into a total mess. People will be at each other's throats and so on and so forth. The whole system will collapse. So we, the Vietnamese Communist Party, have to stay firmly in charge. And we can deal with, on the edges, with critics of one kind or another, and using responsive and repressive measures. So I don't know if it's an age thing. I do know there are discussions within the party, and I can think of individuals. I have some friends who are much younger than me, and they're party members, and they're very, very critical of how things work. I can think of some of my friends who are party members who are my age or somewhat older, who are also critical, very critical, and some of them very open in their criticisms of how things go and where things should go in the future. So from my experience, it's a mixed bag. It doesn't cut along age. very much, if at all.
Thank you, Ben. And again, my apologies. I'm not going to be able to ask all the questions. I'm going to ask one final question and then turn it back over to Mary after some thanks to Ben. I'll give the final word to David Brown, whose writings on Vietnam and Vietnamese politics many of us follow. Ben, David is asking about the growing online internet and social media space, or lack of space, for criticism. Something that probably was not as much of a factor when you began your research into this topic, but has become an enormous issue, pro and con, as you were doing your work. David talks about a dramatic corruption of this online space for discussion of national policies in the last several years, state instructions to take down offensive posts and to mute frequent offenders. He's asking for your thoughts about how public political criticism interplays with social media, both during the time you were doing your research and in the last couple of years.
Yeah, well, David's right. And it's very personally, from my own political perspective, very discouraging that authorities have become much more hostile to online activity. It's much more difficult now in the last 2 or 3, 4 years for critics on various issues, not just on democratization, to post their material and have it stay up and be and have interaction. The government has taken a much more rigorous, rigid stance. The internet law of a couple of years ago was the parameters for that, and now they're implementing it. It's very unfortunate, I think. And it has resulted, it's put a crimp. Hopefully not, it's not a death knell, but it has put a crimp on what activity can occur online and in social media, blogs, and so forth. Those I mentioned in my talk, I showed a photo of a couple of online magazines put up and carried out for years by pro-democracy groups. Well, those have collapsed in 2016, 2017, partly because of these challenges that now have become more common in carrying out that kind of activity. I don't think it's a death knell. I think these things will continue. People do continue, try. They can find ways of getting around some of these blocks. So I think the criticism online and through the social media will continue, but for the moment, it's going to be less than was the case during much of the time I was doing research for the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. And to a number of other questioners, my apologies that we did not get your questions. Sarah Colm, Hollis Stewart, Edward Powell, Al McCoy, and others. Ben can see the questions, and I'm pleased to forward them to him as well. Let me, on behalf of everyone, we had over 60, 70 people from around the world today listening to Ben Kerkvliet talk about Vietnam's responsive-repressive regime, or depending on the issues, Vietnam's repressive-responsive regime. Ben, thank you very much on behalf of all of us, and I will turn it back over to Mary.
Thank you. Terrific talk. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Mark, for giving a terrific introduction and moderating. Don't miss next week. I'll let everybody go, but don't miss next week's talk with the intriguing title, Eating and Being Eaten, and that's by Sophie Chow. And go to our website to find out more about that and the rest of our semester's talks under the menu item lectures. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks, everyone, for the great questions.